Ladies and gentlemen, very welcome to this panel number 12 on innovation as a new driver of growth in Africa at the Infrastructure Africa Conference. My name is Kunrad Bezuidenhout and I'm the convener for this panel. A little bit about the topic. Innovation is undoubtedly a critical element of economic development on the continent, but it must be accompanied with enabling policies, relevant skills, and core infrastructure. In a broader context, innovation should incorporate local content along with a component of public-private partnerships. Furthermore, the private sector is required to represent a focused and sustained role in developing the associated factors required for more impactful innovation. Nonetheless, innovation has the capability to shorten the length of time required for structural transformation across the continent and should represent an extensive element of Africa's strategy for inclusive and sustainable development. I can just mention that I recently was in a very interesting conversation across the African and Indian Ocean developing island states, where innovation was also considered as a driver of growth, and where one of the international academics described it as something that's often regarded as a bit of a stepchild when it comes to considering growing African economies sustainably. And so it's quite a sometimes seen as a complicated factor in relation to developing African economies, but one that is very necessary to consider. And to discuss this very important topic today, we've got three very distinguished panelists that we are very lucky to have. Firstly, Ndivuyo Rapulu, Executive Director of the National Cleaner Production Center in South Africa. A short introduction to Ndivuyo. He heads up, as I said, the National Cleaner Production Center, which is the resource efficient and cleaner production program of the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition in South Africa. And it's hosted by the CSIR, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, which is quite a renowned research structure in the country. He also plays a leading role in various national forums, as well as on the continent and internationally, and is currently president of the African Roundtable on Sustainable Consumption and Production, and chairman of the EU and African Partnership on Sustainable Consumption and Production. He also chairs the steering committee of the African Regional Economic Labeling Project and serves on the executive committee of RECPNet, the Worldwide UNIDO and UNEP Resource Efficiency and Cleaner Production Forum. Finally, Ndivuyo is the non-executive director of various social and sporting organizations, a trustee of the Desmond Tutu Diversity Trust, and founder and member of the board of trustees of the Proclaiming Life Church in Centurion. We then also have Tilda Mwai, a researcher with African Knight Frank. Tilda currently works as a researcher focusing on commercial and residential market research across the continent for African Knight Frank. She's tasked with producing market-leading reports such as the Africa Report and Africa Horizons, thought leadership white papers, and analysis on the office, retail, industrial markets, as well as specialist property sectors such as healthcare, agriculture, and data centers. Alongside this, Tilda is a regular speaker and panel host at key industry conferences in the Africa region and a regular contributor to regional and international media outlets, including but not limited to the BBC, Bloomberg, and CNBC Africa. We're then very fortunate to have Mohamed Seri, a co-founder and director of Hamela Wireless, Atlas Communications, and HQ Holdings. Mr. Mohamed Seri is a proven business development practitioner with managerial experience spanning across multiple industries and regions. His prior engagements include the facilitation, acquisition, and deployment and sale of telecommunication licenses and mineral rights. He is the co-founder and director of Hamela Wireless, Atlas Communications, and HQ Holdings. He currently serves as a special envoy for trade and investment in the Office of the President in Sierra Leone. This position gives Mr. Seri the comfort to interact with key decision makers, both in the private and public sectors across the globe. Mr. Seri has a degree in information sciences and technology from Drexel University in Philadelphia, which he earned in the year 2000. I think in starting our conversation, shall we start with something general? And Luvuyo, if I can put the question to you first, how do you believe innovation can contribute to Africa's development?
Thank you, Conrad, and good afternoon to my fellow colleagues, panelists. In every industry that we want to grow, or in every economy that wants to grow, innovation is at the center of new markets development or product development, especially in the era now where work conditions or business conditions are no longer as usual. You need to become more innovative. Innovation will respond to your ability to provide skills and empower your team, but the company is able to be innovative in terms of product value chain, in terms of access to resources and raw materials that enhances the value and the quality of their products. Innovation, which is coupled with research and development, becomes an instrument for technology localization or technology transfer and localization, which is what, as a continent at the moment, I believe we need to begin to speed up the process of technology transfer and technology localization. But one strong element for Africa is that we have not, in my view, explored or used opportunities of local knowledge system. And I think innovation creates an opportunity for us to identify local technology, local skills, and innovate around how those could be used to access global markets, but also the trade amongst ourselves as African. If you look recently with the continent approving a Africa trade agreement, for that to be successful, for that to be effectively implemented by member countries of the African Union, you need to create an opportunity for entrepreneurs and also academics to continually innovate in terms of resource extraction, resource use, but also in terms of circular economic opportunities for remanufacturing and reuse of what you may currently qualify as waste. How do you take that and create new markets opportunities? But I'm more excited because in Africa, the ability to do trade and the ability to transfer skills and knowledge, it's based with the majority members of our society who are women and young people. And therefore, you have a pool of young people who are creative, innovative, and you have a pool of women who are, by the way, in my view, the breadwinners of the continent. And if you allow innovation to integrate them, incorporate their knowledge, I think we have an opportunity as a continent to create an economy that could stand against the larger economies of the world. Thank you.
Well, I think those are some very important points around the importance of innovation to create opportunities for women and children, or women and young people, and also a very interesting point around innovation as a driver to grow the emergence, or to promote the emergence and growth of the circular economy on the continent. And I hope we can return to those points. But for now, Tilda, I want to turn to you and ask you about the significance of innovation to the property sector on the continent as a driver of Africa's development. Is innovation important to the property sector? How does it play a role in brightening the prospects for the property market across the continent?
Thank you so much, Conrad, and thank you for having me. Back to your question, I think just supporting what Dimple has said in terms of innovation as a driver for growth. Of course, in general, that's usually really tied to the GDP prospects of a country and also overall in terms of the economy. When you look at the real estate market, innovation has actually been one of the leading themes that we have seen come out of the pandemic and also continue to manifest itself in the different property sectors. And one of the ways that we have seen innovation coming into play is that innovation, we saw that generally most innovation-led cities act as greater attractors for investors. So this is actually backed by research that we conducted off the back of the pandemic, just to understand how important innovation is coming off. And so basically what we did is that we took over 100 different indicators that we can say are linked to innovation, whether that is the number of startups in a country, whether the level of innovation, startup infrastructure that is in different countries, the level of funding that we are seeing, especially for biotech, the level of research institutions in different countries, all those different indicators. We took over 100 different indicators, applied them to the over 500 cities that we have in Africa, inclusive of the ease of doing business. And what we came up with is a short list of the top 10 innovation-led cities. Of course, they're not any strange. So the top city that we had is Nairobi as a leader for innovation, where Nairobi has a good balance of research institutions, ease of doing business, startup funding, and all that, the different variations. And so what we have found is that investors are generally drawn to these cities that offer a good balance of innovation and also the economy. The other thing that we're seeing from a property market perspective is that innovation is then resulting to demand in the different real estate asset classes that will generally play out as if they are no longer relevant. So of course, there has been a long-standing debate, especially off the back of the pandemic, what the future of the office is going to be. But in the places where we're anticipating that we are likely to see more innovation, then we're likely to see more increased demand into the commercial spaces, just so that they can provide and host the different talents that we are likely to see being attracted into these regions. And obviously, maybe the most direct one is an increased demand into the alternative asset classes such as data centers. We have seen an increase in demand of data centers over the past year, and this is linked to technology innovation and the level of growth that we anticipate will play out in that sector, and also the different legislation that is being enacted in different countries with regards to data sovereignty, just to allow for those levels of growth. So it's very varied, but yes, it is definitely impacting the real estate sector.
Okay, I can just perhaps at this point already anticipate that some of our participants or viewers or attendees at the conference will have some questions and would like to ask you to direct your questions in writing in the chat function of the video conference facility of the Zoom, and that the participants will be on hand to answer those at the time of broadcast. I'm pretty certain that one of the questions that will be forthcoming is about this innovation, this list of the most innovative cities that you have done the research around. You've mentioned Nairobi. Perhaps I should just quickly ask if there's some other cities that you'd like to highlight that you gotten information on, and then we'll continue with Mr. Mohammed Seri?
Yes, so among the top 10 cities, really, we had Nairobi featuring at the top, and then we had Cape Town, Johannesburg, cities such as Lagos, Addis Ababa, Cairo. Really, the main culprits that you'd anticipate would feature in this list. Among one thing that was actually quite interesting is that a city such as Kampala featured as the third city in terms of the level of innovation that is happening. So Kampala, of course, have gotten asked a lot of questions in terms of how come Kampala featured as the third city, judging by the fact that it's a smaller city and we don't really hear much in terms of comparison when people talk about innovation. But what we have started seeing in that specific city is that there's increased startup activity. There's also increased focus in terms of research funding, the number of institutions, the ease of doing business, and all that. So there are quite some outliers on the list, but yeah, it covers across board.
Okay, that's very interesting, Mr. Mohammed Seri. I turn to you now. I think in the list that Tilda just mentioned, I think Lagos was there, but the majority of the cities are in Southern and Eastern Africa. Is there perhaps a particular perspective that you can bring us from the West African point of view as far as the importance of innovation as a contributor to Africa's development, both from the West African point of view and perhaps also from the tech sector where you are, tech and telecommunication sector where you are quite active?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Conrad, and good afternoon, fellow panelists. Certainly, I will just touch on Nigeria for a while, but I think I would like to address agriculture as a major driver for development in the continent, considering the population of Africa and how it is estimated to rise into 2.4 billion by 2050, and how 60% of the world's arable land is in Africa. So I think if we're talking about development, these are areas that we need to reconsider and see how we can deploy technology effectively to create jobs for our people and also create sustainable revenue. It's a big challenge. By 2050, the world population will be up to 10 billion, and the market size will be bigger, the land will not increase. So I think in terms of opportunity, agriculture provide the right space for African governments and institutions to invest and deploy technology. In Nigeria, in terms of what you're talking about, let's look at the structural imbalance. You look at Nigeria economy today, 75% of the formal economy is almost dominated by the informal economy, in the sense that if you just formalize through innovation, such as the payment system, electronics payment system, the net positive gain can overcome all the loss that you have on the commodity downturn in terms of GDP. So countries like Nigeria, you bring that informal economy and formalize it through the use of payment system, there is huge dividend. So I think what we have to do is, how do we bring the unbanked, how do we continue to expand on the fintech in some of these areas that before were not considered part of the economy. So I'll look at agriculture. Why agriculture? I'm specifically emphasizing on agriculture. I look at the potential that we have, and I also look at how technology has really made it something very, very attractive. We talk about big data. We talk about how we can use cutting-edge technology in terms of automation and the use of data farming precision methods, drone technology, IoT methods, data analytics that can actually predict crop production, can actually predict soil fertilization and all the rest. So for me, I will look at agriculture as a major driver for development in Africa, considering the fact that we have the markets, we have the land, and the need for it, and also the global market is wide open. And now we have various technologies that we can implement and utilize to make it far more precise, far more predictable, and less time consuming. Before, we used to use intuition to predict weather, we use intuition to fertilize our soil, but with all this technology now, various BI models you can use can tell you your nitrogen patterns, can even tell you how you farm in different soil conditions and what kind of inputs you can use. So I think in the next program, I'll talk about some of these tools that I think are more essential in driving that growth in the sector.
Thank you very much for that input. Of course, very important, the role of agriculture on the continent and the potential for innovation to promote that sector. Of course, agriculture also very important to the fortunes of women and youth on the country. Women, of course, the majority of the agriculture practitioners on the continent. But then on the other hand, agriculture has also got a huge importance in terms of providing feedstock for the circular economy, which is growing in importance because we have to reduce the amount of resources that we use, reduce climate impact, and so on. And so, Ndivuyo, I think when I return to you now, I want to touch on that point. I was recently involved in a project on the importance of intellectual property reform to promote circular innovation as one way to try and promote economic growth on the economy. Your involvement in the circular economy is certainly probably the most prominent from our stakeholders here, given your activities at the National Cleaner Production Center. What kind of constraints do you feel are there for circular innovation on the continent, and what kind of actions can be taken to have more effective policy frameworks to influence continental innovation with regards to the circular economy?
Yeah, there are basically three biggest constraints with regard to innovation, but maybe broadly about economic activities at large for the continent. But these constraints are also opportunities in my view. The first one, which is the most obvious, in terms of climate change and carbon emission issues, it's environmental quality or environmental protection opportunities. With the increase in biodiversity loss in the continent, you need to become more responsible as to how you use raw materials and resources, and thus required to be more efficient and only take resources, extract resources that are required for your processing. And therefore, you would have to be very innovative to make sure that if you need 5 kilograms of raw materials, you cannot then go and extract 10 kilograms. You need to extract what is required and make the most out of those resources in terms of quality, in terms of quantity, and also the market needs, market demands. So I see environmental consideration as a big issue. The second one is, of course, as we are predominantly developing and third world continent. So the challenge of access to finance, access to financial resources and opportunities, which then requires us to spend more money in innovation to find alternative solution to what the market requires, but also to what would be value economically to an African or a developing community point of view, both affordability and cost of producing the product. So you would have to be very innovative in how you find opportunities to create markets for products that are relevant, and even the durability of the product that you produce would then have to speak to someone who have little opportunity to constantly change the product or the service, and also have little opportunity to access the product. So your economics plays a large part in influencing innovation and influencing access to the most durable, the most technologically advanced products in the market. The third area, which we often speak about but do not act much on, it's the most of the innovation, most of the technology advancement, except perhaps in the telecommunications arena, where it's almost like every single person has got a mobile phone or mobile device. But if you think about it, in the rest of the other artificial intelligence technology for IR, majority of the consumers are not engaged or involved in the innovation that's happening. And thus it creates gaps in how the innovation is responding to basic needs and necessity in a community, or responding to the most critical issues in a community. I find that, for example, with your mobile, you can do banking, you can do shopping, you can do communication, you can access the World Wide Web, which is good. But is that the most efficient and effective way for most of us in the continent to really find ourselves with an ability to innovate? And I find also that, look, I'm also a senior manager in the CSIR, and I'm surrounded by a number of scientists and engineers who are publishing and developing new patents almost on a daily basis. And some of this we sit and we have a discussion about the relevance and the use given current African economic conditions. In South Africa at the moment, the biggest discussion is access to electricity or energy resources, with Eskom struggling to meet our daily electrical capacity in the last 5-7 years, or even 10 years. And we are always asking, with the innovations that are happening, we should not forget to make sure that these innovations are energy efficient, and we adopt energy management systems that allows for whoever buys into this technology or whoever uses this technology should not now have a stress that I have a technology, but I do not have access to electricity, and thus that technology is inefficient or it's no longer competitive. And therefore, innovation can become a stimuli for other alternative activities that create new markets, but activities that would also guide the focus of innovation in the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tilda, I want to turn to you again. We're starting to look now, obviously, as I mentioned before in the question to Ndivuyo, more at effective policy frameworks to influence innovation. If we turn to your sector, and I think Ndivuyo already started to speak to that, obviously there's innovation that needs to look at how do we make use of resources more efficiently? How do we, for instance, run our real estate assets more efficiently, energy and so on. But of course, another big thing with sustainability innovation, particularly in the property sector, would be product service systems, where I think probably the most, the best known examples are fulfillment centers in terms of logistics on the one hand, and then on the other hand, shared working spaces, of which WeWork's probably the most well known, but there are various others that have also entered into that space. Now, what I want to ask is have you come across situations where policy frameworks has prohibited the development of new business models new technologies that can bring greater efficiency, greater profitability, greater sustainability in the real estate sector across the continent. Sometimes we know that regulations are perhaps slow to catch up. We've seen that in mobility already with things like e-hailing and the last mile loop, things like Lime Bike, for instance, where the local regulations in cities have struggled to catch up with those developments, yet they create new forms of economic activity. Have you come across similar examples in the real estate sector across the continent as well?
I think, Conrad, for the real estate sector, it has been, especially for Africa, in most of the situations, it has been more of the regulations playing catch up to the sector. So, for example, we know that innovation most of the time usually arises from a need that has been identified in the space. And so for real estate, one of the needs that we are seeing is the need for green buildings. So to enhance sustainability. And over the past year, that has become quite alive. And I think we have all seen ESG, or environmental, social, and governance as a term, come alive quite often. And so for real estate, one of the ways that ESG is especially coming into play is that people are being quite cognizant of the spaces that they occupy and the buildings that they operate from. And those reflect the sort of brand values and ethos that they would like to align with. Now, when you look at the regulation towards green buildings, most of the countries are still playing catch up in terms of this. And of course, there are some countries that have led, or there are some countries that have been doing particularly well in that space. So South Africa is a world leader in terms of green buildings, and a country such as Rwanda is playing catch up because now they do have a regulation in terms of commercial buildings and them being compliant to green standards. But of course, the challenge then always comes in terms of implementation. But that is another entire discussion, I think. The other way that we're seeing is that tied to that, you brought up the question of shared spaces and real estate really as a service, real estate evolving behind just the form and structure, or it just being a building, but people interacting with it as a service. So with that, we are seeing the notion of co-working spaces, co-living spaces, whether it's dark kitchens, when you look at hospitality, then we are seeing Airbnb, for example. And then because these are all new concepts, and because these are concepts that in most of the countries are really just at the very niche stages, so you're seeing that there's some bit of confusion. So for example, when you look at the Airbnb space in a country like Kenya, you will see that the government is intent on taxing Airbnb service providers. These concepts are all essentially in the niche stages. We're seeing different governments or different regulations being brought up to looking at probably regulating these spaces. So for example, for Kenya, we saw a new legislation, proposed legislation, in terms of taxing Airbnbs or imposing a specific tax to Airbnb service providers. But there has been a lot of debate in terms of what essentially that means and whether or not it will be killing a service that has not even gotten established yet. It's just at the starting phases, whether we're just being too quick to impose taxes on that. And I think also just connected to that is, for example, from the logistics space, is the concept on e-commerce and the aspects of e-commerce is through the lens of retail, formal retail, and also through the lens of logistics. And of course, e-commerce again only accounts for 1% or form of retail trade across Africa, but it is a growing notion. And so far, we do not have specific, or rather there's still some bit of catch up that is being done in that space. So overall, I think, Conrad, it's for the real estate space and the type of innovation that we are seeing, there's a lot of playing catch up, and also some bit of just trying to get our feet on the ground as a continent and trying to figure out all these new notions that are coming up.
Okay, but I think what's very interesting there is that one of the themes that come up from your intervention just now is that a lot of it sounds to still depend on the diffusion of innovation to be effectively carried through, so that there's take up of new technologies, new business models in the market to benefit amongst other the real estate sector. And you mentioned there, for instance, the example of Airbnb, regulations not catching up with it, and because regulations not catching up, consumers are not getting exposure. Consumers are not getting exposure, so it means that they can't make use of the platform economy to develop new things, for instance, to rent spaces so that they can rent it out as accommodation, which of course would prevent take-up from the real estate sector. But I think with that diffusion of innovation story, and as well the points that you mentioned around e-commerce, connects again very nicely back to one of the two themes that Mr. Mohamed Seri mentioned earlier, which is around the transformative potential of electronic payments on the economy. And we'll, of course, come back to agriculture still, but Mr. Seri, I would like to just stand still for a moment at this issue of payments. It's not only, of course, in West Africa where electronic payments or greater use of electronic payments, new payment systems have got transformative potential, but it's a complicated sector, both in terms of innovation on the one hand and conducive policy frameworks. Now, with the AfCFTA, there were discussions around protocols for investment and financial systems payments and so on. And then, of course, payment systems have also got national consequences. Countries would like to retain a degree of sovereignty over their payment systems in certain instances, especially in light of certain countries having experienced collapsed payment systems in the face of sanctions on the continent over the last 2 or 3 decades, and various other sorts of systems. Of course, financial inclusion also creates a lot of obstacles as well as opportunities. If people aren't trustworthy of normal banks and normal payment systems, it becomes even a bigger obstacle potentially to move them to electronic payment systems and things like distributed ledger currencies. Where do you think we are in terms of this, and what do you think are useful steps that governments can take in terms of regulations to help move the system along? Is there something that the private sector can do in this regard? Because quite clearly, as you mentioned, great transformational potential for many African countries where the informal sector is still playing a very large role in the economy.
Oh, yeah, well, given the serious fiscal constraints that many African governments faces due to this pandemic, it is generally worth it for them to consider the private sector. In terms of payment systems, I think blockchain can provide a major role in terms of facilitating trade and ease some of the problems you just highlighted. For instance, I'll give you trade finance position of documentation, wherein importers and exporters have to trade in documentations for them to clear their imported goods. Before, it would take between 7 to 15 days for an importer to have all the necessary paperwork documentation for them to receive their goods. And they have to wait either through faxes or through mail and all that kind of thing. But now we have blockchain technology, which makes that process way, way easier by creating a platform wherein all these documentations are scanned and checked and processed and get instant transmission to the importers or to the clearers of the goods on the other end. So with blockchain technology, we can actually fast track some of these processes efficiently and effectively and cut down the time and resources that we spend to facilitate some of these businesses. But on the flip side also, we're talking about policy here. Policy frameworks are very, very much important. Why I mentioned policy framework very important. You look at the US, for instance, as recent as last week, the government of the United States, the Senate just passed a $250 billion tech bill, tech and manufacturing bill. What that bill is trying to do is to contain China and making sure they give incentive to the tech industry in the US. Where do Africa fit in? Africa fit in on several fronts because 52 billion of that money is spent on semiconductor research. So if you are saying semiconductor research, who provide the inputs of the semiconductor? Most of those minerals, the rare earth minerals, are found in Africa. So how do Africa as a whole, can be part of that equation by making sure they also put in policies in place that can tell them, okay, you're coming for the rare earth minerals, but you have to set up research labs here. You have to invest a certain percentage of that money or production on the continent. So our population, the youthful population, can benefit, and business people in the private sector can also be part of such an opportunity. So I think policy, we have to emphasize policies wherein we also look out for the continent by making sure, as countries like the US are looking for their own people, they are looking to counter China. How do we prepare ourselves, looking at the competitive advantage that we have with raw materials? So we can insist that 20 or 30% of our raw materials should be processed on the continent. For countries who lack the necessary infrastructure like energy that Mr. Dube was talking about, we can say, okay, we export them to another countries in Africa that have excess energy. And that country can also move the goods back to the continent and make sure we participate in the production process. So in terms of policy, we just have to be careful and we just have to be forceful in implementing policy that look out for the Africans, that look out for the continent, as opposed to just go with what they are saying in the West when we have the natural resources on the ground.
Thank you. That's I think that's quite clear. But of course, as you mentioned earlier, agriculture is very important, and we spoke now about how blockchain can enable logistics across borders, and we spoke about payment systems, and of course, all of this has got works of technology and telephonic platforms. And there are actually incidences, as our conversation now needs to turn to public-private collaborations and multi-stakeholder collaborations. There are instances where all of this is actually leveraged quite nicely on the continent to try and promote agriculture, particular agriculture practice by youth and women in rural areas. I think of an example in Kenya, perhaps Tilda knows them, of the One Acre Fund NGO that works there, and in a number of countries like Rwanda, where they use cell phone technology to get production inputs as on a small loan basis to producers, to rural women and youth practicing agriculture to try and promote it. What kind of innovations and collaboration do you think is required around the promotion of agriculture on the continent? I've spoken now, of course, about communications technology and payments technology, but there is, of course, also the inputs, the seeds and so on, where we need to develop useful varietals for our climate and our nutrition needs on the continent. I'm very interested to hear your inputs on this.
It's a good question. There are three things, and of course, what we should also note is because of the diversity of the member state in the continent, the states are at different level from a policy maturity point of view, but also from a GDP point of view. So I like what Mr. Siri said. There's a need for a stronger collaboration and stronger sharing of capacity and capabilities amongst countries themselves. And I believe that this then influences, because innovation is also a tool to stimulate activities in a product value chain. So if you're talking of communication, so everything else from the beginning of the manufacturing of a mobile device to the data that is used or the network that's used, then you have to create and stimulate a innovation capability, and also identify suitable stakeholders and partners, either from another nation or the private sector in those communities, or even the public, the communities. And one leg that maybe you imply it's the academics, the universities in the continent, their role in facilitating innovation that responds to local needs and technology transfer. It's important. So in my view, I believe that if innovation is based on public-private partnership, it allows for the consumers to speak to the producers of the product, but it allows for government to be involved as well from a enabling policy framework for such innovation, either from a market development point of view or from allowing the greatest challenge we have in the continent. It's I know it's a discussion going on in South Africa, for example, in terms of Wi-Fi, fiber, data management, and who controls it, how much do you have, and what does it mean to free the space or to free the access to data or to fiber. Now, if you bring, for example, the revelation that has happened in the continent with allowing mobile network operators to come into the space, we all of a sudden got people are able to do banking through a cell phone. People are able to do shopping through a cell phone. So you are now creating an opportunity for new innovation to happen by just one twist, which means industry, government, and the community become stakeholders and partner. But the last point I want to make is that probably public-private partnership is a way of channeling resources, financial resources, but also channeling opportunities for young people, for local people to access resources, to be able to become innovative. I've always asked myself, with the number of cell phones that are dysfunctional or that have been out of service, idling in a community as waste, or that are being handed from first to second to third to fourth generation. What are the opportunity for recycling, for remanufacturing, and also opportunities for waste management policies that informs how to do that in a safe, responsible, and reliable manner. So public-private partnership in this case would come and say we have a consumer pay responsibility, but we also have a producer pay responsibility, which means the policy must be enacted that allows the producer to look after the value chain of their product, but also allow the community that is using the consumers of that product to also be part beneficiary of that product value chain in terms of remanufacturing, beneficiation, in terms of recycling and reuse of that product. So public-private partnership will solve access to resources, access to finance, but it will also create opportunity for our innovation to be on par competitively with other innovators across the globe. Then you also accessing international market in that manner. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Nvuyo. Mr. Siri, did you want to make any remarks in terms of how public-private partnerships can support innovation for growing agriculture?
Obviously, thank you very much. And I think in all this, as my colleague have just highlighted, money, capital is very, very important. And that's why public-private partnership comes in. The government can reduce some of the conditions. Let's say, for instance, in the absence of cash, government can create policy that can say, okay, for the banks, we can reduce your cash reserve ratio so you can release some of this money and give it to the private sector if you invest in certain key sectors that drives innovation. So instead of you having a cash reserve ratio of 30% that you just hold on, we can say, okay, 10% of that one can be released and you put it in sectors that are highlighted as strategic. Another key area will be government can also increase their borrowing capability by set up what we call liquidity sustainable facilities. These liquidity sustainable facilities will allow government to push their debt burdens and making sure their obligations are somehow pushing in the long run so they can have enough money to inject in sectors that we consider strategic, especially as it relates to innovation. So the marriage between the public-private partnership we're talking about is all about how we inject capital by making sure we have policies that will put money in the sector and allow innovation to go. Because without money, the research and development we're talking about, all is money. So that's why when you look at the bill the US government passed, because they have money, 52 billion of 250 went into research and development. We don't have that. How will African countries come together collectively and create those kind of hubs that will be financing research? Because the talent is on the ground, the raw materials is on the ground, but possibly the capital, you and I know, is a major problem. So how do we make that capital available so we can have a win-win situation for both the public and the private sector?
Okay, thank you very much for that. We're now in the final stretch. I think we've got about 8 minutes left. Tilda, some final comments from you, and I think we've just spoken about triple Ps and how that can help liberate some resources for investment and innovation in the sectors. Is this something that's also applicable to the real estate sector from your point of view?
The one thing that my colleagues have really emphasized on is that innovation does not happen in a vacuum. And it's true even for the real estate sector. And for the real estate sector, it's very specific to resources and infrastructure that is available for this form of innovation to happen. So for example, earlier on, I spoke about data centers that have been a direct result of the different innovation that is happening and us seeing a growth in that sector. But the one thing that we're seeing, and even for data centers, obviously, as we continue to come up with the different innovations for Africa and information continues to flow, then the demand for data centers, and there's enough supporting evidence that data centers demand will continue to grow. But we all know that, for example, for data centers, they need a lot of power for them to function. Basically, data centers require 99% of uptime for them to function. Knowing our power challenges in countries such as South Africa, Kenya, basically across the board, then that becomes a challenge for us developing and investing in that particular asset class as a supporting factor to innovation. And so the government then being able to solve some of these infrastructure challenges is a good example of how the government's role comes into place. The other thing that we're seeing even from the pandemic is increased demand in alternative sectors such as healthcare, and the role of the government in supporting healthcare development has always been amplified in terms of collaboration between the private sector and the government of how they can come into play. But what we have seen is now there has been a growing conversation in terms of this collaboration, either from a development perspective and even from a workforce perspective, how governments can partner in place. So we're seeing different PPPs vehicles coming into place, PPP vehicles such as building, operating, building, owning, operating, and transferring back to the government. These are different ways that, different ways that the government is and the PPP angle is playing out in the alternative real estate sector. And finally, I think even from a logistics perspective, the one hindrance to logistics is that, number one, it is very capital intensive. Putting up any sort of warehouse, especially because most of them are usually horizontal, take up so much land and occupy a bit of space. And they're directly linked to the activity that is taking place, whether from a trading point of view or from a manufacturing point of view. Then location of locating these warehouses and these logistics facilities becomes quite important. But you cannot locate these facilities in places whereby there are no roads, for example, to deal with it. So then that becomes one of the ways that either the government is hindering this sort of development or where it needs to improve in terms of these sectors. But one of the ways that we've also seen the governments, different governments in different countries enabling this sort of real estate sector is through the development of special economic zones in some of the countries. So these zones, especially developed with a specific focus to aid different people who are undertaking different activities in these countries in terms of importing and also exporting goods. Then because there's such sort of agglomeration and also coming together of resources, then it really opens up the space in the specific places where they're located. So there's a lot going on, maybe not directly linked to public-private partnership vehicles, but there's definitely a very big role in terms of the government coming into play in the real estate sector.
We've got 2 minutes left. I'm loath to introduce anything new in Divuyo. You did mention the issue about the cell phones. And of course, a lot of innovation doesn't happen at the macro level, but starts with individuals and small businesses and so on. In South Africa recently, the Competition Commission introduced what basically amounts to right to repair regulations or provisions for the automotive sector. Now, if we add that, for instance, for cell phones or washing machines, although, is that the kind of thing that you think could provide a push factor for innovation at the micro level? Perhaps just 20 or 30 seconds on that, and then we'll go to Mr. Siri for closing comments.
I agree with you, and I think it is the right step by the government, and we need more of that in each sector because it influences the investment opportunities and making funding available for SMMEs and entrepreneurs, but it also forces government indirectly to build infrastructure, either in terms of ICT, logistics, or infrastructure in terms of the literal service delivery, potable water, sewage management system. So when they do that, they are saying to someone, go start a business. Where you start a business, we must provide services for you to succeed. So it stimulates other value chain issues that leads to economic development. But I was writing down that it also forces government to make sure that they have incentive programs that are there to support the SMMEs so they can survive. One of the biggest challenge to entrepreneurs in the continent is that whilst Western countries will be talking of 5 years, in South Africa, it takes you 3-4 years, you are gone, you can't survive. So government needs to then put infrastructure to incubate and help these SMMEs to survive, therefore creating employment, creating economic growth opportunities in the country. So it's critical.
Thank you very much. Mr. Siri, any last burning comments from your side?
Well, I'll just touch on upskilling initiatives. which I think was something that's supposed to have come up. There is a popular economics magazine saying that says Africa's future is dependent on the mines and not on mines, meaning capital is arguably more scalable through innovation than commodities. Half of our population is under 20 years old, and I believe such demographic assets should be converted into economic dividend by empowering women, as in most countries, 7 out of 10 of them work in agriculture. So I believe about empowering and at the same time making sure that population that we have, which is an asset, we transform it into something that can generate a lot of revenue for the continent.
Thank you very much. And with that, we'll have to close now. I very much would like to thank again our panelists today, Mr. Ndimvuyo Rapulo, Mr. Hilda Mwai, Mr. Mohamed Siri, and to our audience, thank you very much for joining us for this very interesting discussion. Obviously, still many issues that could be covered under this as innovation, such a broad topic. I do encourage you to put your questions in the live chat. I'm certain the conference organizers can send those for written response if there's any further comments as we now reach, or questions as we now reach the end of the session. But thank you very much to all of you, and have a lovely day and conference further.
Thank you very much. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.